In the last video, you saw the 31 pairs of spinal nerves. We're going to look in more detail at that, where those spinal nerves emerge from the spine. So right here, this is a spinal nerve. And here it is on this side. So these are the structures that we saw emerging between the vertebrae. Now we're looking at a transverse section of the spine. So we're looking like from the top down into the spine. This is the posterior side. So this would be the part toward the person's back. And here is the anterior side. So this would be the part toward the person's front. Remember in chapter 12, you learned about the 4 functional divisions of the nervous system. You have somatic sensory, visceral sensory, somatic motor, and autonomic motor. The spinal cord is split into those 4 divisions. You have this area of the spinal cord is white matter. So this is all the axons that are running up and down to the brain. Then this butterfly-shaped thing is your gray matter. This is where your cell bodies are. And it's split into 4 sections. So this back part here that's teal colored is the posterior horn. This has the cell bodies for somatic sensory. Then the dark blue part is also posterior horn. And this is your visceral sensory. The orange part is the lateral horn. This is autonomic motor. And the red part is the anterior horn. And this is somatic motor. So those 4 basic types of functions of the nervous system are split up into their own areas of the spinal cord. And notice that the anterior side of the spinal cord has all of your motor function, and the posterior side has all sensory function. Then we have roots that connect the spinal cord to the spinal nerve. So these are your roots. You have a posterior root. This has sensory axons. Here is the anterior root. And it has motor axons. So you can just see the color coding here. You have the blue and teal in the posterior, and you have the red and orange in the anterior. Notice you have this swelling here on the posterior root. This is the posterior root ganglion. And it has the cell bodies of your sensory neurons. So these little bumps in here, those are cell bodies of the sensory neurons. Your motor cell bodies are all right here. So for your sensory neurons, you have the sensory axons come in like this through the spinal nerve. They go into the posterior root. You have a cell body right there in the posterior root ganglion. Then they continue into the spine and they go to the posterior horn. Then they synapse with other neurons there. For your motor, they have their cell bodies here in the spine, and then their axons go out through the anterior root and into the spinal nerve. The next picture is the same thing, just a different view. Now we're looking at a frontal view of the same thing. So here you can see the butterfly shape, that's your gray matter. And you're going to have your, right here is your posterior horn with visceral sensory. I'm sorry, somatic sensory on this one. Then right here would be posterior horn with visceral sensory. Then here is lateral horn with autonomic motor. And here is anterior horn with somatic motor. Then here is your anterior root. Here's your posterior root. Here's that posterior root ganglion. And then this part is your spinal nerve. In the next picture now, we zoom out a little bit. We're looking at this same picture but with a little more context. So now we have the bone. So here is your vertebra. And here you can see is your spinal nerve emerging between the vertebra. So this part right here is the spinal nerve. And you can see this little swollen area right here. That is that spinal root or posterior root ganglion. Okay, if we zoom in, you can see here is your posterior root, and here is your anterior root. And then here is the spinal nerve. So there's the parts you already know. And you can see here's that butterfly, the gray matter. It's going to have the anterior horn, lateral horn, and posterior horn. Now let's add in some more structures. From the spinal nerve, it starts to branch. This part is a posterior ramus. And it goes to the muscles and skin of your back. So this is the muscles of the back. So the posterior ramus is a branch from the spinal nerve. that innervates the muscles and skin of the back. Then you have this part is the anterior ramus. Many of your anterior rami go through a plexus, which we'll talk about soon. And then they go on. Notice it's larger than the posterior ramus because it innervates more things. Your anterior ramus, these are what are going to innervate everything on the front side of your body, your limbs, and your organs. So all the muscles and skin of your front, your limbs, and your organs. Then we have this part down here. These two little branches here are rami communicantes. And they lead out to this, which is a sympathetic trunk ganglion. This is a special path for your autonomic motor. So the autonomic motor neurons, axons, are going to come out of their lateral horn through this anterior root, through the spinal nerve, and then they're going to come like this through rami communicantes down here to the sympathetic trunk. Okay, so there's the part you'd see from a transverse view looking into the spinal cord with a little more context. You can see the spinal nerve emerging out between the vertebrae and what it branches into. Then I mentioned the plexus. So those anterior rami, many of them go to a plexus. So a plexus is a web of anterior rami. Okay, up here in the neck, this one is the cervical plexus. And the rami from it have nerves that come out that are going to innervate the head and shoulders. Then you have the brachial plexus. And just think of your words that you know. Brachial is arm. So these nerves are going to go to your arms. Then in the thoracic region, notice here, there's no web. They don't interweave. So there is no thoracic plexus. Instead, these are what's called intercostal nerves. And remember, costal means ribs. So these nerves run along the ribs. Then, as we continue to move down, we have the sacral plexus. This is going to go to your legs. Then we have, I'm sorry, that one's the lumbar plexus. This one is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is going to go to the legs, feet, butt, and perineum. Then there are a couple of nerves that I want to mention. From the cervical plexus, you have the phrenic nerve. This nerve is important because it's what innervates your diaphragm, which is the muscle that makes you breathe. And from the sacral plexus, you have the sciatic nerve. This nerve is special because it is the largest nerve in the body. And you may have heard of sciatica. This is when you get painful pinching and swelling of this nerve. It's pretty common. A lot of people get this nerve pinched and irritated and inflamed, and it can be very, very painful to have sciatica. So these nerves, we will practice this more in class, understanding what happens as you emerge from the spine, but here's your introduction.